Welcome. This is a very special episode of A RAP CRITIC. I am your boy Malik16. And no, I didn't get lost, but I am quite found. And today I have a special guest, very special guest, a distant mentor and one of my music heroes, Unc, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Oh, well, hey, I'm Kwame Vear. I've been playing hip-hop on the radio in Harlem since 1992. Started out with a program called Hardcore Righteousness, and then life happened, and I was like, oh, I need to call it something different. And around 2004, changed the name of the show to Equilibrium Radio. So
Hip hop for grown-ups.
Yeah, we are adults who love hip hop. So that's the journey right there at WHCR 90.3 FM. Been there since 1992, and gonna be there until I decide to stop, or until somebody tells me that you can't do it anymore.
And so, that's City College radio station, for those of you who are uninformed. Mm-hmm. Is this a station that people can pick up in this now digital era? It used to be, if you only lived in a certain place where you can get it on your bandwidth. I used to listen to you on the radio, on my Walkman, like I had to find the station. But now in this digital era, anyone, anywhere can hear your show now, right?
Yep. It's either a 7 or 10 watt station, so it reaches the whole community of Harlem and the surrounding areas, which would be Queens, Bronx, Jersey. But with the digital age, we have moved to the internet also, and we go to whcr.org, and we're there. You can listen to all the programming there live.
And he's being humble. He's not telling you that he's one of the public access pioneers of the 90s era, where there was a movement of just new creative innovators on what's considered public access TV in New York. This is before digital was, and you were part of a real creative team. And I used to catch the show every now and then. You want to speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. We did this program called Demented Minds, and at first we were doing, we was playing music videos, right? And then all of a sudden we was like, we gotta do something different than music videos. So we started doing comedy skits, and they still, every once in a while you can still catch a couple of episodes because our show was so popular, and there was a lot of shows that came after it. It's just a tradition of black people being creative about things. So Demented Minds, you can see on YouTube. We got some, I think we got a channel up where you can see some of the skits, and had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, I could tell that. Did you have an alias on that show? Because I remember it was the Iconoclast. That name will always stand out to me.
Yeah, there's I always use my first and last name given to me by my parents. Right. So I was okay with using that, But there's been I think there's been some nicknames, but nothing that I was like, oh, I'm gonna use a nickname instead of my name.
Gotcha.
So
the roots are deep here. The history is deep. I'm about giving the flowers while people are still here, man. So I'm like, I need to do this with, I consider him my music Unc and Unc by other connections, but and also just because you're an expert on the culture, and so it's like, what's an album that we can go over for the episode? And ironically, this is an album that you came and saw us perform live when we were doing our live Plates and Crates events. Mm-hmm. And I was just hoping we did it justice and didn't massacre it, because it was a weird night. It was cold, but this allowed me to go back and do some of my own homework. So with no further ado, the album we're talking about today is It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back by the legendary Public Enemy. And this album was released in 1988?
Yeah, 1988. The summer of 1988, by the way.
Wow.
So it was like, for me personally, I was still in high school, and this album was released during somewhere on the cusp of the summer or the beginning of the summer, and I listened to the album for the whole summer, 8 weeks, every day, all day, for 2 months. So, I mean, if I listen to it like that, I can imagine other people who listen to it like that. And it was really an impactful piece of artwork, of expression. And so that is, when you ask me what's the most important hip hop album I've listened to that's impacted me the greatest, it would be that particular album.
Wow.
So
I'm trying to think if I could even relate to it. I think it was written 8 years later. Is the album I spent kind of that same experience with. If I think about an album I purchased and kept playing, straight and lived off for a minute, and then I spoke about this in my Daylight episode, how I took a turn, and you were part of me taking. That's the irony. Oh my gosh. So yeah, that summer of '96, I spent listening to It Was Written, and then there was a line. I think we were around some younger kids, and my cousins were like, "You can't play this around kids," and I really started looking at what I was listening to, and I was like, "Wait, I can't relate to any of this stuff that Nas saying. I'm a teenager. He's talking this real mafioso stuff," and so I had discovered, WHCR one day, and you were playing music like the Love Song remix by the Bush Babies and De La, and they were talking about how all this other rap is going way too far with the mafioso and the outlandish stuff, and I was like, I'm gonna listen to this station whenever I can catch it. And I think at that point you weren't on every day.
Yeah, at that point it was 96. Yeah, I would say we was on either 2 or 3 times a week, because at one point early from 92 to about 94 we was on every day during the weekdays. So from 4 to 6, and then as time moved on, they added new programming. So so it's possibly it was either at the 3-day mark or the 2-day mark.
Yeah, I think
at that point.
I think I was catching maybe twice a week. It makes sense, because after your program would be like the reggae show would come on, and so I just really appreciated that I was finding all this music that I would never find on my own. This is when the source was important, so I would reference these records after hearing them on your show, and you were just always good at explaining. You were playing rappers from Japan and Germany, and most of the stuff that was being played, because you've always run a very balanced show, but it even with the balance, there was a great representation of positive messaging, and that was the beginning of my backpack phase. That was a turning point in life. Okay, so this is category 1. In category 1, we go over the album, the product itself, in 10 dimensions. And if you have not already, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel as we build this global hip-hop community. We're going to jump right into dimension 1. The first dimension, the quality of the production. Kwame, what do you have to say about the quality of the production on this album?
The Bomb Squad, the team that's the Bomb Squad.
Keith Shockley, Hank Shockley, and Eric Sadler.
Yeah, so you have those 3 guys who are composing and patchworking all of these sounds from their experience, right? And everything was just, technically it was just beautiful to hear, because it's like, what's that? It was always like, if you're really listening for sonics, we're not even talking about the vocals added to that. We're just talking about, here's a new piece that you're listening for, right? Or here's a new piece of it that you're hearing. The production was so great and grand and multi-layered that's the reason why it's like going from throwing rocks to creating a slingshot.
The evolution. It's like the next phase in Arsenal, right?
Yeah.
I listening to Night of the Living Bassheads, and just the choices they made, the randomized splicing. I think they were really Frankenstein beats. That's really, what you were describing there. There's just, for no reason, in the middle of the hook break, they like play the ESG UFO sample. It's not even a major part of the beat. It's just to break the monotony. And in one of the articles about the album, I think Hank Shockley was saying, we wanted it to shock people out of their comfort zone, and we just wanted to shake things up a little bit. And it sounds like it's the natural evolution of where hip-hop was going. We were moving from simplified 1-2, count bass melodies and just simple drum beats into how do you match these drum beats with these samples? And they're like, well, let's throw 3 samples on, because on the other side of town, Prince Paul was doing the same thing with Daylight. It's just that Bomb Squad were making this aggressive, explosive hodgepodge. But then that begs the question, do we think these beats are dope just because we remember the time? I'm always big on separating nostalgia from, does this still stand? Does it still knock today? Sonically, you don't think any of it sounds dated?
If I go back and listen to it now, I would say, yeah, there's things that you can say that's dated, but it's not so dated to the point where you can. It's like listening to The Message, man. Like you listen to The Message. It's for most people, it's the most important rap song ever made, right? But when you go back and listen to it, you can hear the age of it, but it's still light years away from what was happening in parties and jams.
I agree.
And still, it's the standard bearer for most rap songs. If you want to,
I don't know. I think you touch. I don't think certain songs don't date the same as others, right? If you hear like Planet Rock, The Message, I think, like you said, it was so ahead of its time that with the right rapper over it today, it still might work. And I think,
well, there's been plenty of rappers who've rapped over it, and it's worked, and they've said what they said, and it's cool, but nobody's playing those records. They're still playing the original song, and
they're perfect. And I think that's what most of the production on this album sounds like. The frenetic energy of it keeps it young. Those whistles and just, they were really playing with the tea kettle whistle sound a lot on that. The sound that you hear on Rebel Without a Pause and the Terminator X joint.
Well, here's the beautiful thing about hip hop music in general. Hip hop music incorporates every genre of music, period. So there's so many ways to be creative with it. And at that time, Bomb Squad, Chuck, Flavor, and everybody else associated with the group came up with something that was original for them and for all of us, because it transcends. It was a shift.
It's definitely a shift.
So, and we're just talking about that particular album.
There's a point that I wanted to mention, something you said about the sampling, but I'll bring it up in the next dimension.
Okay.
So something for y'all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5. Heartbeats, where do you rank the quality of production on this album on 1 to 5? Dimension 2, the cohesiveness of this sonic bed. It's one thing to have an album full of dope beats, but how well does the album blend together? How well do the songs flow into each other? And so you mentioned how hip-hop takes from, and I think Public Enemy was very blatant with trying to explore different sounds from different places. So you get a song like Yo, She Watched Channel Zero, which is from a big rock sample, but it sounds like it blends in with the rest of the album. You remember at that time feeling like, oh, this is a rock song, or did it just kind of hit?
No, it was like, okay, well, this is a rock song, but here's the thing. At that time, when rap albums were made, they made a song. There was specific songs for specific audiences. that weren't the audience that they were initially trying to get into.
Right.
But since they're when you're a musician and you want to make music, you make the music that you feel like making.
Not all the time, but
well, I mean,
for the most part.
Yeah, in theory.
In theory.
Just in theory.
I love that.
So it's just at that time it's like, okay, well, maybe they submitted the album and they had this song in the back pocket, and he's like, hey, we need a rock song. And he's like, word? We need a rock song? Cool. Let's put this song on here. And, it's still the same type of content that they was talking about throughout the other songs.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of...
still hip-hop drums.
Yeah, we're still talking about drums. We're still talking about the bass.
It worked.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think rappers do rock-inspired songs, and it's a standout in a bad way. It's like, ooh, this threw the vibe of the album off.
Mm-hmm.
To the point that you brought up, I think Chuck D has spoken in interviews about how he was always into rock to some level. It was his idea to collaborate with Anthrax later on. He even shout out Anthrax on the album. And I think he said that was a part of just, showing the harmonizing power of music. But let's not forget, there's also Def Jam, the height of the 80s, Rick Rubin Def Jam, where that kind of became the standard at Def Jam to have a rock-inspired song on an album just to shake things up,
Yeah. So, you gotta think about the executives that were in the building. Because, even though rap was this new emerging thing, they're still executives. And they're still like, hey, we gotta sell this album. So, that may have been the case for PE, or maybe not. But whatever the case is, she watches Channel Zero. Is it fit within the realm of what their album is?
It sounded like they had a lot of creative control on this album. I think one thing this album gets credited for a lot of with the cohesiveness is the skits. The fact that they use these musical breaks, Mind of a Terrorist, and Showing What You Got, the S1W kind of thing, and then just to give you little spaces between the songs. It's like, okay, here's a music break and the song's going to come back. So it turns this, I guess it would have been a 12-track album into a 16-track album because you got these music breaks. And sometimes those are glue. Pete Rock and Premier are famous for doing those kind of things. Like at the end of songs, they'll play you like 8 bars of a sample of something else, and then it leads into something else. So I think sometimes that helps glue things together. But even without those, it feels like the album would have flowed together nicely. Because then you also have concert skits or just skits. I think they said they have like Mr. Magic in the beginning of the Flavor Flav solo. He's like, I'm never gonna play a PE record again. I didn't know they had beef.
They had a disagreement. But
and then you got Flavor in the concert or at the end of the song, they like, turn that beat back. Y'all want to hear the beat again? And Flavor Flav with the whole bass for your face, London. And so people like those things because it feels like an experience. I think. Is that true? Is that the case? Like, you listening to this album, hearing those little pieces, as random as they were, it helped feel like you in the world of PE.
Yeah, exactly. That's what, especially when you're dealing with something that is musical and auditory. It's the whole thing is a theater of the mind with regards to whatever expression is going on, right? So you would hope that that you're pulling people into what you're doing. That's what, and when I'm listening to something that's good, I'm normally getting pulled in, so I can't really listen to music, and I can't listen to music with vocals in it and try to read something.
Right.
Because it'll jumble, it'll conflate, and,
something to get overlooked.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just, and if you're listening to a really good album, then, or you're listening to some music that you like, then it's only natural that you get pulled in. Hence the reason why we listen to music in the first place.
There you go. So, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How cohesive was this album in your opinion? And that takes us to dimension 3, the question of, was there an intentional mood or tone or theme on this album, and if so, how well was it executed?
Oh, well, whatever what's 5 heartbeats?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 5 heartbeats on there. Just because everything was executed in such a way that, listen, if you have an enemy, but you have to do business with your enemy, right? And you're putting out messages that goes against this adversary, but it's business,
right?
And they release it, and it's successful, and it leaves this. It has this impact on a culture of people in just the industry all by itself. You know, that's a powerful thing.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what happened with Public Enemy. Like with this particular album, first album, not so much. It's like, oh yeah, that's great, let's party. This album was super intentional.
Yeah, it was like an answer. I mean, the first 2 songs tell you where their headspace was. Bring the Noise is like the what do you call it? The credo, right? And then Don't Believe the Hype is responding to kind of what the reaction to their first release was. It's like, oh, this is what you think of us? Now we're going to double down on it. And I think Louder Than a Bomb really is the song on this album that sums up the feeling of this album. It's like, okay, I hear what y'all saying. Here's what we got to say.
Yeah. So, you know, and in a time where it was just the only communication was either in magazines or it was either in the barbershop, in the streets. This is a time where that's the time that I lived through.
Right.
So it was like, okay, you know, these guys will go on the radio, and if they really had something to say, you know, you hear what they have to say there.
Right.
But it wasn't a 24-hour stream of
access,
Twitter, Instagram. You know, if you got an account, then, you know, and you got an opinion that day and you want to share it, it can happen.
Yeah.
So it took a long time for the back and forth to go outside of magazines, because magazines were the main engine for this communication.
And that hadn't even picked up steam like that in 88, you know, unless you were in that world. This is something you touched on earlier where you said this music was for you. It was for young black people. And I think, you know, I've read some articles that said that P was making message music for everyone. If you're down with the message, you can be down. But at the core of it, it was unapologetically black.
Yeah.
And so something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, the messaging and overall tone of this album. One thing they do a fair job of, which I think kind of got lost in later P albums, there's a balance of still having this battle rap edge and still wanting people to party and jam, because they'll say, you know, I wrecked the show, and you know, at the party you play this and you dance. Like, they weren't anti that, but they're like, you're gonna get this message in too.
Yeah.
So, Dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. So how well of a job do they do at having the songs have their own life, and was there any redundancy on this album, either through the words or the sounds?
You know what? I don't recall there being a ton of redundancy. I remember not liking the slower songs personally, but you know, when you're 16, you want to hear hard, fast songs,
Right.
So yeah, I don't remember it being redundant outside of, if we're going to put redundancy in there, I would say that since we're talking message music, it being a message music driven piece of art was absolutely redundant, because it was definitely intentional. But I like what the intention was. So, and I was like, oh yeah, I can rock with that.
Yeah, I think when it's compartmentalized into different pieces of a greater message, that's where the real artistic direction is. It's like, are you gonna hit me over that with the same words and the same point, or are you gonna make different points of this larger umbrella? And so you are getting that on different songs throughout the album. Like Night of the Living Bass Heads, there's not another song talking about the drug epidemic at the in the 80s. That's that song. Channel Zero, that's that kind of song. This woman representing the black woman in America in general is like a metaphorical thing.
Well, just representing anybody in America, they just so happen to use
Good point.
a black woman, you know.
Good point.
So, you know, just representing how informed you really are by watching the mainstream media that's in front of you, and just watching only that.
I think the only thing that gets repetitive here are the internal references to group members, the way that they call each other out and reference each other, right? It's always, hey, yo, Professor Griff, get the S1Ws, and we're going to do this, you know? We're going to take action, or Terminator X. If you get tired of hearing them say Terminator X, this ain't the album for you, because it's said all through this album. But we talk about that kind of repetition, and that's purposeful repetition compared to lazy repetition. Some rappers just run out of creativity and start repeating things. Like, didn't they say this line? When you talk about branding, like, hey, I'm purposely saying this to rep my crew or to remind you of this, that's a different kind of repetition. I think that's what you were pointing at with the redundancy, like message music, but not where it's like, okay, I'm tired of hearing this message. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. The song distinction or repetition of words and sounds. That takes us to dimension 5, the amount of content versus the amount of songs. Now, you already brought up this is a 16-track album, but only 12 of them are really songs. Some of those are just instrumental breaks and moments. So out of 12 songs, the ratio of content to songs, do you feel this is a nice matching? Anything in balance here?
No, nothing imbalanced.
Did they talk about enough stuff throughout the album where, you know, kind of what we were just talking about a second ago? Do you feel like the message music was balanced out with, you know, all the other stuff that was being done on the album?
Yeah. I feel like the message music, and then what's going to happen is I'm going to either be a 4 or 5 heartbeat on every level with this particular album. Let's just put it at a 4 so that you know, we can move on, because we don't want to be redundant.
There's this, yeah. I mean, I love what you said about the braggadocio, because they take breaks. This is not the version of Public Enemy where they're splashing, or it's Brand Nubians that's super splashing you with messages on every song. It's gonna be in there. Bring the Noise is a mix of both. They're telling you who they are, like we said, it's their credo. There's splices of message, I'm a black man, but it's also talking about sucker MCs. Then you get songs that are straight, like Rebel Without a Pause. I'm in my bag, I'm bragging. You know, this is not a political song, I'm just bragging. But then it gets downright political on the Prophets of Rage, or you know, Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos. So it exists. I think the ratio is intact, and I think that's part of what made this album legendary, is that this was still the version of Public Enemy that they want you to still have fun, but they also want you to get serious when it's time to get serious. It reminds me of the Digital Underground Sons of the P album, where they were kind of the same guys that are going to give you No Nose Job and, you know, the Heartbeat Prop song. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that takes us to dimension 6, features. 1988.
Yeah. There's no features that I can recall on this album. Maybe in the videos, you know.
Oh yeah, MC Light and Night of the Living Bass had a couple people cameo in there.
Black Steel and Chaos, Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos. In the music video, you know, they're in prison. You know, there's EPMD. There's a whole bunch of other music, rap artists in there.
But it's,
so, you know, and it didn't need cameos because the group was so big. You know, so it was so many contributors in the group.
Right.
So
the posse cut didn't become a thing until like 1989. Whenever the symphony came out, that changed the game. For you gotta have a posse cut on your album, and then people just really went into it going into the 90s. But this was still the era where groups all had their distinct imprint, and this was about, you know, solidifying and planting your flag in the ground. So like you said, a group is large, an ensemble group is P. It's always more than Chuck and Flav. They're the faces, they're the vocalists. But yeah, it was self-contained. No need for features. But features is just a category. It's a dimension that we have. Because sometimes features can saturate an album or bolster it.
Yeah.
So
So for this particular dimension, yeah, we'll go with a 2.
Well, it sounds like you're more on the 5 because it's like they were good without it. You know, that's always the question to consider, whether you think not having features or having features is a good or bad thing, and then you rank that on the scale from 1 to 5. 5 if you think it's perfect without features, and take away if you feel it's a takeaway. Dimension 7, does the weakest song or do the weakest songs weigh the album down? Do they take away? And I guess the first question would be, is there a weak song on the album, or what would be the weakest song if we had to pick?
Well, I stated a little bit earlier saying that Black Steel and Hour of Chaos, I didn't really particularly like it because it was a slower song. So I'm always a mid-tempo, fast-tempo type of person.
Okay.
But the rhymes were so hard.
Super.
I got a message from the governor or the president the other day. Opened Reddit and said they were suckers. I was like, okay, I ain't got to like the music, but what he just said was,
right.
I was like, yeah, I would have said they were suckers too.
And I think that's the song where he's cursing the most too, and he's that aggression is coming out on that song.
Yeah.
I get it. A lot of people feel that way with the slower songs. With me, I think it's more like the feel of the song that makes it weak. So the party, fight for your, is it party for your right to fight or fight for your right to party?
Party for your right.
Party for your right to fight, because I'm thinking Beastie Boys. They fight for your right to party, right? So this is, again, that Def Jam connection. The sound of that was probably the most light sounding beat on there, but they make up for it by harmonizing Chuck and Flavor's voice together. But when the beat came on, I was like, okay, this is kind of light. I'm glad they saved it for last. It was like not a poppy kind of sound, but it was the most upbeat, light song on there. And then some people might consider that weak, and also if you don't feel like having a history lesson in the form of a song, then you might consider that weak. The other song that I think a lot of people might consider weak is Flavor Flav solo, Cold Lamping with Flavor. If you're not ready to hear that deviation after hearing 2 strong songs out the gate with Chuck leading, with Flav is pretty much kind of rapping about food and freestyling.
Yeah, well, like the great thing, it's like everybody knows the roles of Chuck and Flav. And you just have to accept it. Well, I mean, you ain't got to accept it. So long as you know that one dude is the academic, for the lack of a better word, and the other dude is a street dude.
Right.
That's the characters that they're, when both of them are just absolutely brilliant. Actually, both of them are brilliant.
Yeah.
But Flav is playing his street dude.
Right.
So, you have to, so long as you know that coming in, then you can accept any Flavor Flav song that's a solo on a Public Enemy project.
Right.
So,
and I think that acceptance going in it, if you're not ready for that though, I can see how people are like, I'll skip this song. And some people also just don't like freestyle songs. We talked about this when we did the Resurrection album. When he gets to This Is Me and Orange Pineapple Juice, I'm like, okay, this is a little too silly after I just heard you do Communism and I used to love it. It's like you're just freestyling and being silly. Some people don't feel that way. They're like, I love it because I love the beat. I felt like that was a weak point on the album. And so I can see how people would think the flavor, just talk about, fried flavor for your seasoning and, whatever he was saying is.
Well, what I would say to that is that albums need levity. You need a little bit of, it's just like food. You need, spices. You need ways to flavor what's there. And, they managed to do that and not alienate all the other stuff that they really intended. So, okay, we could say Party for Your Right to Fight and Flavor Cold Lamping, or the weakest songs on the album, but look at the other 10 songs.
It's like food, yeah. Something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. What do you think the weakest songs are? Do you even think they're weak songs on here?
I would go with the party for
your right to fight.
Party for your right to fight.
But does it weigh it down?
It doesn't weigh it down.
So this would stay at a 5 for you?
This, you know what?
Or would you bring it down to a 4?
I would bring it down to a 4 because, you know, you say Don't Believe the Hype is the weakest song on the album.
Yep, some people feel that way too. Chuck said he didn't like Bring the Noise until they started performing it. So, Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. Was this the kind of album that you could tell it was going to have reach? I know you mentioned earlier, you know, artists have to please themselves sometimes. I have strong feelings about that just because I'm like, if you're going to put yourself in a public space to perform for the public, you always have to consider the public, no matter how much it's from the heart. There's a marriage that has to happen between what you want to express and who you want to reach and how you're going to reach them. Otherwise, you're just making self-indulgent music. This album, do you think it had mass appeal from its inception?
I don't think any artist that is on a major record label, especially at that time, is making music that they don't want to be popular. Because at the end of the day, it's business for the executives who gave them the record deal. And, you know, a lot of times, a lot of the artists, they were just collecting artists and releasing whatever material that they had that they wanted to release and hope that they were able to recoup. But this thing, you know, they were already proven moneymakers. I'm assuming that they recouped off the first album. But this thing, the trajectory of hip hop moved forward because of this particular album and, you know, the following album. So I would say, was it intended to do that? Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
But what it did was exactly that, and then some.
And then some.
Yeah.
It took their bar was raised. The Public Enemy status was raised.
No, they not only did they raise their status, they raised hip hop's. They raised the status of hip hop, and they raised even more so the status of rap as art.
There were decisions made, you know, we talked about the She Watched Channel Zero, the Rock decision, whether that was, you know, a collective, Rick Rubin and, you know, like you said, from the executive side and the artist side, like, oh, okay, this will give us a more expansive sound. And then, you know, clearly in the singles being chosen, Rebel Without a Pause was probably the riskiest. It was the most unorthodox single of its time. There were no other songs that sounded like that. But I think Don't Believe the Hype, doing that familiar James Brown sample, that was a more simple, that was a mid-tempo song. That was a safe record. Plus they were addressing, but they still, and you mentioned this is what you said when we were talking about Dimension 3, they executed it in this way where I'm speaking adversarially and it still is working commercially.
Yeah.
That's the brilliance here. This album was all about risk, but calculated risk, I think. You know, what's a good way for me to address the media? Let me make something that media has to play. I remember hearing Don't Believe the Hype everywhere. And like I mentioned, you know, they're making references to still wanting you to be party people and dance. So there's that appeal. There's no songs about dating or romance and, you know, sex and things like that. And there's no outward, this is for the, you know, shaking on the dance floor kind of songs, but the sensibilities are there with mostly mid-tempo and up-tempo songs. So it's like, you want to put this on the dance, you know, play this in the, I think, no, he says it on Don't Believe That, play this at the LQ, right? So there's still that.
Yeah.
So there's a mass appeal factor here, and this album did go on to sell and chart. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 9, everybody's favorite, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, and influence. You've already kind of touched on all 3 of those. The impact of this, you said it raised the bar for hip hop.
Yeah, it's the reason why in the past few years they have been given honorary awards. It's the reason why they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's the reason the impact was absolutely undeniable, and all of the eyes that you said, they accomplished all of that with that second album, and going forward. So yeah, it's 5 heartbeats on each of those.
This was the original reverse effect for me. I never understood. I think I mentioned when we were talking about one of the other dimensions, who the audience was. As much as this may have been intended for inner city youth, it seemed like the biggest proponents of the Public Enemy movement were college students, already woke people who shared these ideologies, who shared these ideologies, and ironically, white people. I feel like white people were some of the biggest and most vocal Public Enemy fans. I remember watching a Murphy Brown episode back in the day, and it was an episode about her having a rebellious niece or something, and she came and she was wearing a Public Enemy t-shirt, and she was explaining why she likes them and they're the music of her generation. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty much what I think of when I think of Public Enemy's hardcore fan base throughout my time growing up. And we saw that replicated when Dead Prez came out, but it's the influence and the impact was one of the most interesting impacts. And ironically, being a group that was accused of being racist the album before, when they doubled down on it, they just got a more diverse fan base.
Yeah, well, you gotta take into consideration, let me say it straight, because I really want to make sure I say it correctly. So in America, there's roughly, the reason why they call anybody who's not white a minority is because in America there is over 300 million white folks, right? So they have a ton of buying power when it comes down to everything, right? Here's my gut answer. They know that information that Chuck was talking about. They know the history of America,
right?
They know their history, and the ones that don't know, they're not surprised to find out that it's not the cleanest, most pleasant history. So that's the reason why they gravitate to somebody who's talking about the history.
Yeah.
So,
and they were the first. It helps to be the first in a wave. They may not have been the first people on record, but they were definitely the first hip-hop act, putting that at the forefront of their presentation.
Well, in terms of being able to be in the commercial space where they're on a major record label that is the hip-hop label.
Yeah.
And
the label.
Yeah. That's the biggest hip-hop music maker. They bring in a ton of revenue, especially at that time. And they was on the rise, and part of the rise because of that particular group. When you have that soapbox, when you have that platform,
yeah,
and they let that music be released, it was going to be, it's 50-50 no matter what. It could have been whoever,
right?
But they were so good in expressing themselves and crafting songs.
Yeah. You said maybe the first album did whatever, but this was the one. I think position-wise, this made them just as important on the label like Def Jam as LL. It's like, oh, there's room for this kind of rap and that kind of rap, and they can both be played at the same kind of party and both go on the same kind of tour. They made that known that this could exist.
Yeah.
And controversy also sells, right? So whether the other races are gravitating towards it because they're not supposed to, or because they just want that truth, they're truth seeking, it worked. The reason you gave me a couple options of albums to go for, but the reason I picked this because I always wondered why this album has a reputation of being called the greatest hip-hop album of all time. That is the legacy, that is the impact and influence. We know the innovation exists on this album just because of the Bomb Squad production. It was innovative because it introduced so many elements that are still used in hip-hop to this day. It was experimental, it was new, but the impact and the influence, for this to be considered, it's either this or Illmatic that I hear in the conversation. You know, like when they talk about the greatest. Everyone has their favorites, but when people usually have to narrow it down to one, it's this album and that. So I think that's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. The impact, the innovation, the influence takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10. The overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. Does this album, if we were aliens and we discovered this in the time capsule and we heard a bunch of other albums in that time capsule, does this stand out as a unique, timeless piece of art? I'm younger than you, which means I heard this through different ears. I lived during this time, but I didn't get to appreciate this as an album as a young man. I got to appreciate this as an album as an older man. So I'm like, I could still appreciate this in the year 2000 something. You don't think it still has that resonance, even if you didn't live through it?
Yeah, I do think so, because at the time, Chuck D was a mid 20-year-old man, you know, like 25, 26, something like that, maybe 27. So he was at that age range, and people at that age range generally, I would say, find stuff that's common to them, right? So if you're in the age range and you hear this album, I would think that it would be something that would appeal to you. So, but let's take that part away. Just as a work of a musical work, I'm like, it's pretty hard to beat this album. It's really hard to listen to it and go, yeah, that was cool, but it was only 3 songs on it.
Yeah, that'd be a lot. That'd be all cap.
I'd be like, all right, well, I hear you, but what 3 songs? And they'd be like, Party Before You Right to Fight. Right. And then she watch Channel Zero and Cold Lamping, and you'll be like, all right, well, I mean, that's what you like. All right, cool, can't knock it. I mean, shoot, those are the only 3 songs you like. That's the only 3 songs you like. Because we're still talking about it today, and while we're just dissecting the album today, it's still as good as it was when it was initially released.
That was my initial question to you. Yeah, to be able to say that, and I know you stand by that.
I think it's a little bit more meaningful than that in the way it's set up. It might be a concept album.
Ooh, we're gonna talk about that in the second category. So
yeah, it might be a concept album.
I'd love to hear why, and so we'll get to that. This dimension, something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How timeless and unique was this body of work? That concludes our category 1 review of It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back by Public Enemy. Join us in the next video, category 2, where we go over the rap performance on this album. Until next time, y'all know what it is. F a rap critic. They talk about it while I live it.